All right, so you wanted to dive deep into Ayn Rand.
We're doing it.
Her book, The Virtue of Selfishness.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
we've got some excerpts ready to go. And I think this is a really fascinating one
It is.
to dive into
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
because it's one that I think a lot of people
It's one that people have opinions about.
have very strong...
Opinions about.
Yes.
And I'm very curious to see kind of what our takeaways are. Having now...
I mean, I've read Rand before.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But this will be interesting to revisit for sure.
So this book, it's challenging traditional morality.
Yes.
And advocating for this idea of rational selfishness.
It is.
And it's really focusing on those values
Right.
that are needed for human survival.
Yes.
And flourishing.
That's right.
But the book covers a lot of ground.
It does.
Ethics, psychology, politics,
Economics.
economics.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot. She's got thoughts on pretty much everything.
We're going to try to focus on those sort of like key,
Yes.
most thought-provoking
Most juicy elements.
Yes.
So
So some questions that we're hoping to answer are, is selfishness actually a virtue?
right.
What does Ayn Rand even mean by rational in this context?
Good question.
And how does this all apply to living in today's world?
Right. So, yeah, how do we take these ideas and
To
make
leave
them...
it practical.
Yeah.
So
Is it living
I
up?
think one of the most interesting things that we see right off the bat
Yeah,
is how she kind of redefines this word selfishness.
she does.
Um,
Because we all...
we
yeah,
know
we come to it,
we think of a selfish person. We think of someone who is greedy,
inconsiderate.
inconsiderate,
Yeah.
doesn't care about other people,
Right. Thinks only of themselves.
only about themselves.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because she really separates it from that
Yes.
common understanding
She does.
of someone who's just like acting without thinking.
Yes. It's not about being a brute or
Approve.
just acting on your whims
Right.
like a child.
Yeah.
Who doesn't get what they want.
Gimme.
Yeah.
So what is she talking about then?
So she really focuses this idea of selfishness is like a reasoned pursuit
Oh,
of values.
so there's that word reason again.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
That are essential
Uh-huh.
to one's own survival
Okay.
and happiness.
So it's not...
Not just survival, but like flourishing,
Yeah.
thriving,
Yeah, okay.
living a good life.
So she actually defines selfishness as concern with one's own interests.
That's right. And that can sound
It does sound bad.
scary to people.
When you
Especially if you first hear it.
when you think about the traditional way we've been taught to think about selfishness.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's about reframing it.
It's 100% reframing
Yeah.
this idea.
So can you give us an example from the book?
That kind of illustrates this.
So one example that she uses is the difference between a man who robs for selfish gain
Okay.
versus a man who builds a business.
Okay.
Both of these men are acting in their self-interest,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But one is rational
Okay.
and one is not.
So the robber...
The robber is just
and
taking,
just acting on a whim.
yeah, or a very short-sighted
Yeah.
self-interest.
Like, I want that thing,
Yeah,
and I'm going to
and I want it now.
take it.
And I don't care who I hurt to get it.
Right. Whereas the businessman is thinking long term.
Exactly.
He's thinking,
can I
I'm
create
going to create something
yes.
that will benefit me.
me and potentially other people as well.
Okay. So it's almost like it's a win-win,
Yeah.
ideally.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
So that's really interesting because she's saying it's not just about
It's not just about you.
me.
It's about understanding that your own self-interest is actually tied to the well-being of others. In a way.
In a way.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very different way to think about it.
It's a very different way to think about it.
Yeah.
For sure.
So then this idea of reason keeps coming up.
Yes.
Why is that so important to her?
Well, she really stresses this idea that reason should guide all of our actions and choices.
Okay.
And it's because she's saying that whims and feelings are not reliable guides
Okay.
for a fulfilling life.
Okay, so she's not saying
We're
that...
robots.
Right, exactly.
We're
not robots.
Right.
We are humans and we have emotions.
Yeah.
But they shouldn't be in the driver's seat.
They shouldn't be driving the car.
No, not all the time.
Okay.
Right.
So how often do we just act on impulse, though?
Oh, gosh.
All the time?
Right.
Like,
That donut looks good.
exactly.
I'll worry about it later.
Or I'm really angry, I'm going to send that email.
Right.
You know?
Or I'm...
But she's saying, I'm feeling insecure, so I'm going to
Yeah.
do this thing that I know
Thinked it through.
is not good for me in the long run.
Right.
Yeah.
And she actually says
She says.
Man has to be man by choice.
That's right.
He has to hold his life as a value by choice.
That's right.
So it's about making conscious choices.
Yes, very conscious, deliberate choices.
And it's interesting because this kind of connects to this idea that we see in today's culture.
A lot of pressure.
Where everyone's telling you, you gotta be happy.
Be happy.
Be happy all the time. Like, it's this...
Toxic positivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
she's saying...
Not that you shouldn't be happy.
No,
but that...
happiness is...
The byproduct.
Yes, of living a good life.
Living in accordance with your values.
Exactly. If you're constantly chasing happiness...
You're never going to find it.
You're going to be miserable.
Right.
You can be very unhappy.
Yeah.
It's like a mirage.
You can't...
It's always out of reach.
You can't grab it.
Yeah.
But if you focus on building a life...
Yes.
That's worth living.
With those strong foundations.
The happiness will come.
It'll come naturally.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
a very different way to think of it.
It is.
Yeah.
So she really believes that happiness is a consequence.
Consequence, not a goal.
Not a goal.
Yeah.
You can't just...
Can't chase it directly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then the question is...
This brings up, I think, an interesting point.
A lot of people would ask.
Like, what about helping other people?
Right.
Because if I'm so focused on
myself, on my own
happiness,
yeah,
and my own
flourishing,
then what about when someone's in need?
Right. What about when someone needs my help?
Right.
Does that mean I just completely ignore them?
Right. Am I just like,
because that's not...
I'm out here.
That's not going to lead to a good life for anyone.
Right.
Right. And she actually addresses that.
She does directly. And this is where she gets into what she calls...
The ethics of emergencies?
The ethics of emergencies.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
So she makes this really important distinction between helping someone in an emergency.
Okay.
Like, let's say a shipwreck.
Okay.
Right.
Someone's drowning.
Someone's drowning, you see them, you help them.
Okay.
Versus what she calls ongoing societal problems.
Like poverty.
Homelessness.
Okay.
All these things that are kind of chronic. Yeah, long-term.
Long-term issues.
And she says specifically, illness and poverty are not metaphysical emergencies.
Okay.
They're part of the normal risks of existence.
So that's a
pretty bold statement.
Bold statement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she's basically saying...
She is saying that...
There's a limit
to how much we are obligated to help others.
Obligation to help others.
Yes. And that's definitely...
Especially push back. Yeah, uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty controversial statement.
Yeah.
Like, are we really just supposed to, like...
Let people drown.
Let people...
Metaphorically?
Yeah, metaphorically drown.
Right.
But
her point
is that...
There's a difference.
Between helping someone in a true emergency...
A true immediate emergency and feeling like we have to constantly sacrifice ourselves.
Yeah.
For the sake of others.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So she really believes that everyone has a responsibility...
Everyone...
to take control...
Of their own lives.
Yes. And strive for
their own well-being. Yes.
Okay, so then how does that tie in?
So then this brings up the question...
To the larger society.
What about the role of government? What about the role of government?
Right. Because if we're all supposed to be responsible for ourselves...
Right.
Where does the government fit into all of this?
Does she think there's a role for...
A role for government at all?
The government at all.
She definitely has some strong opinions.
She does have some strong opinions.
About that. Yeah.
So I think that's a perfect place to...
Pick up.
Next time.
Yeah. All right. So we were just talking about individual responsibility and where that leaves the bigger picture.
Yeah. Where does the government fit in if we're all supposed to be looking out for number one?
Right. Like, how does that all work?
Well, this is where Ayn Rand's ideas about individual rights come in.
Okay, let's talk about that.
For her, this is like the cornerstone of a free society.
So what does she mean by individual rights exactly?
She's talking about those fundamental rights that every person has just because they're human.
Okay, so like the right to exist, exactly. The right to live your life without being controlled or harmed by others.
So to make your own choices.
Yes. To be free to pursue your own goals and dreams.
And I guess that includes owning things, right?
Absolutely. The right to property is super important to Rand.
It's all starting to connect now.
It all ties together.
Like her whole idea of rational selfishness only works if people have the freedom to actually pursue their own interests.
That's the
without stepping on each other's toes.
Precisely. And for Rand, Respecting individual rights is the best way to make sure that happens.
So it's like a delicate balance.
Yeah,
Everyone has their own space to grow.
like a garden where each plant needs room to flourish.
I like that analogy.
It really captures Rand's vision of a thriving society.
Okay, so where does government fit into all of this?
Well, for Rand, the government's role is very limited.
Limited how?
She believed it should mainly focus on protecting those individual rights we were just talking about.
So like making sure no one's getting robbed or hurt or having their stuff taken away.
Exactly. But she's not talking about the government providing for people's needs or telling them how to live.
So she wouldn't be a fan of big government programs?
Not really.
Like social safety nets or a lot of economic intervention?
She'd see that as overstepping boundaries.
And potentially infringing on individual freedom.
Right.
Yeah, that's definitely a controversial stance, especially these days.
It is. It sparks a lot of debate.
Like, where do we draw the line between individual responsibility and the need for collective action?
It's a tough question.
And honestly, Ayn Rand's views really push us to confront that.
They force us to think critically about what kind of society we want and how much power we're willing to give to the government.
I think it's safe to say she was pretty skeptical of government overreach.
Definitely. She saw it as a major threat to individual liberty.
Almost like a slippery slope towards a system where the individual gets lost.
Exactly. That's why she was so passionate about defending those individual rights.
And this ties back to her whole critique of altruism. Right.
It does.
This idea that constantly sacrificing yourself for others can actually be harmful in the long run.
She believed it could create a culture of dependency and resentment.
Instead of empowering people to take control of their own lives.
Right, and that's where some people get really uncomfortable with her ideas.
Because on the surface, it sounds like she's against helping anyone.
It can seem that way.
But is that really what she's saying?
I don't think so.
I mean, obviously we should care about others.
Of course, compassion is important.
So how do we reconcile that with her emphasis on individual responsibility?
Well, maybe it's about finding that balance.
The balance between taking care of yourself and lending a hand when it's truly needed.
Right.
Maybe it's about helping people in a way that empowers them rather than creates a sense of obligation or dependence.
That's a really insightful way to put it.
Ayn Rand definitely makes us think about all of this in a new light.
She challenges those conventional ideas about morality and forces us to question our own assumptions.
Okay, before we get too deep into that, there was one more thing that really struck me about Rand's views.
What's that?
This whole idea of moral gray areas. Like, did she believe they even existed?
That's a really interesting question. So we were talking about moral gray areas.
Yeah, like, is there ever a time when it's not so clear-cut?
That's a great question. And it gets to the core of Ayn Rand's belief in objective morality.
Objective morality. So she's saying, like, there's actually a right answer.
For her, yes. There's a right and a wrong, a good and an evil. It's not all relative.
But come on, isn't life a lot more complicated than that?
It can seem that way, sure. But Rand would argue that even in those messy situations, reason can be our guide.
So no hiding behind it's complicated.
She'd probably call that out. She believed in thinking things through, using logic to arrive at the moral choice.
It's like she's saying, step up and take responsibility for your decisions.
Exactly. Don't shy away from those tough choices.
I can see how that could be empowering, but also kind of scary, right? Like, what if I get it wrong?
Well, that's where the emphasis on reason comes in. For Rand, it's about constantly developing that ability to think critically and make choices based on principles, not just emotions.
So it's a process. It's not like you magically become a perfectly rational being overnight.
Right. It's something you have to cultivate, work at, and sometimes you might make mistakes along the way.
But the important thing is to learn from them.
Exactly. And to keep striving to align your actions with those objective moral principles.
It's interesting, though, because sometimes it seems like people use moral grayness as an excuse.
To do what?
Like to avoid taking a stand, or to justify actions that they know deep down might not be right.
Ah, so you're saying it can be a way to dodge responsibility.
Maybe. Sometimes it feels like it's easier to say, oh, it's complicated, than to actually wrestle with the tough questions.
I see your point.
Yeah.
But for Rand, that kind of thinking was dangerous. She believed that true morality requires clarity, conviction, and a willingness to face those complexities head-on.
This is all so thought-provoking. I'm starting to see how all these pieces of Rand's philosophy fit together.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it?
It is. Like how her views on reason, individual rights, and rational selfishness all connect to this idea of objective morality.
And how that all plays out in the real world.
Exactly.
It definitely challenges us to rethink our assumptions about how we should live and interact with each other.
Okay, before we wrap up, there's one last piece of the puzzle that I wanted to mention.
I bet I know what it is.
Rand's views on racism.
Ah, yes. That's a crucial aspect of her philosophy. It might surprise some people.
Well, a lot of people associate her with right-wing politics, but she was actually very much against racism.
Absolutely. She saw it as a barbaric and irrational ideology.
But she also saw a link between racism and collectivism.
Right, and that connection might not be immediately obvious.
So explain that one to me.
Well, for Rand, both racism and collectivism share a fundamental flaw. They both judge individuals based on their group membership rather than on their own unique qualities and actions.
So it's not just about prejudice against a particular race, but about any ideology that elevates group identity over individual identity.
Exactly. Whether it's racism, nationalism, or any other form of collectivism, she saw it as a threat to individual liberty and a betrayal of the principles of reason.
Because it's like saying you're guilty by association, not because of anything you've actually done, but just because of the group you belong to.
Right, and that's completely incompatible with Rand's philosophy of individualism and her belief in judging people based on their own merits.
This is all so incredibly thought-provoking. It really makes you think about all the different ways that we categorize and label people, often without even realizing it.
And how that can lead to prejudice and discrimination.
Exactly.
So for Rand, the antidote to racism and all forms of collectivism was a firm commitment to individualism.
To seeing each person as a unique individual with their own rights, values, and potential.
Right, and to judging them based on their own character and actions, not on the actions or characteristics of others.
Well, that's Ayn Rand for you. Bold, challenging, and always forcing us to confront those big questions.
She wasn't afraid to shake things up. And whether you agree with her or not, there's no denying that her ideas are powerful and have had a lasting impact.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface of the virtue of selfishness in this deep dive.
There's so much more to explore in her work.
So to our listener, we encourage you to pick up a copy of the book and see what you think. Wrestle with those ideas, challenge them, and form your own conclusions.
You might be surprised at what you discover about yourself and the world around you.
And join us next time as we take another deep dive into a new world of thought-provoking ideas. Until then, keep those minds sharp and, as Ayn Rand might say, the purpose of life is to live it.